Himangi Yadav.
Yes.
Yes, we can begin now. I've put the meeting live on YouTube and they're recording. We can start.
Ma'am has joined.
Yes, ma'am has. Ma'am's here. Good evening, ma'am.
Yes, good evening, people. I'm here. So sorry for the delay in joining. My laptop went on a auto restart mode, so I was helpless on that. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. So I'll begin. Hello and good evening to one and all. I am Himangi Yadav for your host for today, day 13th of the 15 days national level e-workshop on UGC NET JRF in English. I would like to extend my thanks to our dear organizers, Dr. Ashok Wagh, Principal of B.N.N.College, Dr. Sudhir Nikam, Head of Department, Chairman, Board of Studies in English for University of Mumbai, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Sashikant Malunkar, Professor B.K. Paik Rao and Professor Rajni Wagmare, who executed this program on the occasion of the centenary celebration of the birth anniversary of Shri Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav. The present e-workshop aims to invite different experts across the country as speakers on an online platform to guide and motivate the UGC NET aspirants and to institute the best tricks to execute the plan of action to crack this exam. So I welcome you all once again. So attendees, our guest speaker for today's topic, which is poetry, will be delivered by Dr. S. Prithvika. She completed her PhD from the Central University of Rajasthan in 2017 and was awarded in the year 2019. Her thesis is titled Expressions of Camus, Existentialism in the Novels of Shashi Deshpande. With 4 years of teaching experience, currently she is employed as an assistant professor at Loyola Academy, Hyderabad. Her research interests are in the field of women's studies, gender studies, Western critical philosophies, Indian and European literature, to state a few. During the course of her research experience, she has participated in various international and national conferences and has published in various international Scopus Index journals. We are delighted to have you with us, ma'am. Now I would like Dr. Prithvika to proceed with the event further. Over to you, ma'am.
All right. I'm just sharing my screen here and then I'll commence. Just give me a minute. All right, I hope my screen is visible and I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Right, thank you. All right, my topic for today is on English poetry. So I have limited myself only to English poetry, considering the fact that poetry itself is a broad genre, and to trace it from Anglo-Saxon and from Chaucer to the entire of English literature, and then to go to American literature and Commonwealth literature would have been an overwhelming endeavor. So I've chosen and limited myself only to English poetry, where I will be tracing the trajectory from Anglo-Saxon, next talking about Beowulf, and then to Chaucerian poetry, talking about the neoclassical poets, talking next about the romantic poets, and then Victorian poets, and then finally to the modern poets. As I proceed ahead, I would also make it a point that I give reference to a few sources so that, that becomes a point of consideration while we trace the entire trajectory. And also as I go along, I would also give, a brief glance at the important poets who need to be taken into consideration while we trace the trajectory from Anglo-Saxon period to that of the modern period. To begin with, we definitely understand that poetry originated and had English literature for a long period was influenced by and was brought in because of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman conquest. And these happenings in history influenced literature of the age. All right, so not delving much into Anglo-Saxon period, we understand that the kind of poetry which took birth in the period was quite bold and strong and elegiac in spirit, and it also spoke about certain aspects which portrayed humans as a victim of fate in the initial period. And then also it somehow showed the futility of life, the sorrow full of the sorrows which inflicted an individual. That was also incorporated in the poetry in the first place. Along with that, we understand that the kind of poetry which influenced, like, the coming of Chaucerian poetry was deeply influenced by a rhymed meter. It had it had a particular structure which it had to cater to. There was a structural element which had to be adhered to. So when we look at the themes which were addressed in the Anglo-Saxon period, we understand that there was the basic idea was to talk about the futility of life and how one was governed by the idea of fate in the first place. We need to keep in mind as we proceed that before we came to Chaucerian poetry, the poetry was heavily influenced by the manner of writing. The style of writing was more influencing when compared to the content of the poetry in the first place. All right. We also talk about Beowulf because any literature, especially English literature, would be scanty if we do not talk about the influence of Beowulf in its writings. And we need to talk about how, there was a heavily influenced Christian idea which dominated this kind of writing. Also, we need to understand the kind of chivalry, the kind of heroic portrayal, the kind of how an individual is the savior of the people. A heroic element, a chivalrous element, guided these poetries, and especially Beowulf, which eventually took a turn. That's why when we come to Chaucerian period, we call that period as a strong delineation from the kind of metrics which ruled. It was, in fact, Chaucerian poetry was also called as the age of Reformation in the first place. It was as though it was an age of modernism. It was an age of new learning. That's how we look at, Chaucerian poetry in the first place. All right. And over time, we also understand with the coming of this heroic gesture portrayed by this poetry, we see the weakening of fate and the kind of dependence on the individual. That was a factor which was taking place, because when again, all these were the factors which influenced the coming of Chaucerian poetry in the first place. So apart from the kind of Christian elements which governed the writings, and apart from the weakening of faith, the dependence on individuality which governed these writings, there was also a backdrop which talks about an impending disaster in these poetries. All right. So apart from this, the chivalrous element and the kind of heroic portrayal, the savior which is being portrayed by the main character in these poetries, this took a turn with the coming of Chaucerian poetry in the first place. I've brought in a few lines to look and trace this path in the first place. As we observe here, a perilous path it proved, he trod who heinously hid that hall within, wealth under wall. Its watcher had killed one of a few, and the feud was avenged in woeful fashion. Wondrous seems it, what manner a man of might and valor oft ends his life, when the earl no longer in mid-hall may live with loving friends. So Beowulf, when that barrow's warden he sought, and the struggle himself knew not, in what wise he should wend from the world at last. All right, so here you also get to understand the kind of archaic fashion of writing, which was also changed. We came about to East Midland dialect, which governed the writings in Chaucerian age. That's one thing you get to understand. And there is also, you understand in these lines, a kind of barrenness which is being portrayed in writing, which is in fact revived when we need to trace again, like I said, the Anglo-Norman writings and the Chaucerian writings, and how it paved a way for new learning, let's say, which came about in the Chaucerian period in the first place. All right, so most of these writings also talked about the struggle of an individual who is making his way through a barren land or through a barren world, and how eventually there is an impending source of disaster, like I said, which governs these writings, and eventually with time how the character proceeds. That's against a backdrop of fate, against the backdrop of a barren land, governs Beowulf and its writings. With this, we come to a Middle English period, one of the most important writings. While we talk about Chaucer as the most important writer in these lines, you also understand that we also talked about the kind of alliteration which governed these writings, and there were 4 stress lines that went about with it. When we talk about the Middle English period, which also brought in the Chaucerian writings, we understood that there were a few factors which brought about a Chaucerian poetry. One was the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a war which actually brought about national sentiments, which brought about a kind of nationalism, evoked a national sentiment in the English audience. And more than that, it also was governed by another 2 incidents. One was the Black Death, and the other one was famine. All these writings also, governed the Chaucerian poetry. With this, there was also an establishment of the printing press, and with that, there was also a lot of, a revolt against the church or the institution of church. Protestantism was in rise. So with that, we get to see that there was a new revival in literature. Alongside that, we also see, when we observe Middle English period, that there was an influence of imitation of French poems and Italian poems in the court per se, and Chaucer himself wrote in the Middle East Midland dialect in his writings. All right, allegory was one of the most important writings which governed. But it was, allegory is also, you can understand, like something like a morality writing. The allegory, what is being painted here, it is to perhaps revive the degeneration which was being brought about by the institution of church. Tales of chivalry that you get to see in the Squire, the tale of Squire, the Canterbury Tale of Squire and Adventure. Chivalric idealization of love in medieval romance. You get to see this in Chaucer's writings of Troilus and Cresside as well, where you see there is a idealization of chivalry. As we are talking about Chaucer here, it is very important here. I've brought in a line of Chaucer. It's very important for us to understand Chaucer's style of writing. Chaucer wrote about his Canterbury Tales when came about sometime in the late 14th century, when he had written Canterbury Tales, which portrayed a sense of humor, which also portrayed a sense of lightheartedness. That's why you understand how Arnold had commented once by saying that Chaucer lacks a kind of high seriousness in his writings. Why? Because Chaucer portrayed the age in his writings. He portrayed the more gaiety, lighthearted age in his writings. So we understand that when we talk of Chaucer, he painted the 14th century in his writings of the Canterbury Tales. He painted the 14th century in his writings. Alongside that, he also brought in to us a realistic picture of the age. We wouldn't say that, I wouldn't call Chaucer as a satirist, but rather Chaucer was somebody who incorporated irony in his writings. He could be that detached spectator, and he could build in some kind of a humor and irony in his style of writing in the first place. So initially, if you understand, Chaucer's plan of writing incorporated about each character to tell 4 tales, 2 on one way and 2 on the way back. But then instead of 120 tales, the text was only resorted to around only 24 tales in the first place. All right. When we talk about the Knight's Tale, as we are looking at here, the Knight's Tale, or let's say the Squire's Tale and even the Yeoman's Tale, for a larger extent, these were the first group of pilgrims at the Tabard Inn, and they were the father, son, and the servant, who formed the household group. When we talk about, the Knight's Tale, which I've brought to you here, Chaucer declares that, you were able to see this line here, that he was able to see that, yes, he was a perfect, genteel knight in the first place. So you understand, as you read through the lines, that, he loves chivalry, and he loves truth, and he loves honor, and he loves generosity and courtesy. courtesy. So you also see that, he is widely traveled and is a hero of numerous battles. So among these are the battles of, for defending the Christian faith against, against Hiternus in the first place. And also his fighting for faith had taken him to the frontiers of Christendom and beyond. All right. And his dress was, stained. You get to see here in the lines that it was stained with the rust and oil from his armor. Alongside that, you also get to see that the glory he has gained, because of all the warfare, he has not made him arrogant, in any space for that matter. Also for that matter, most of the recent critics have also said that, there is a keen sense of satire that you see in these writings. And then this could be, this could be a writing when you see Chaucer's writing, which has been placed, it does not include the two extremes of the society. It does not include aristocracy, and it does not include serfdom. Both of these, the writing which it has catered to is more of a writing which is the middle-age audience, or let's say the middle class audience is actually critiquing the writings of Chaucer in the first place. And you also get to understand that most of these writings, especially the Prioress Tale, is one of the most humorous passage what you observe in the prologue in the first place. Also along with that, we get to see that the monk, another portrayal which you see that he's a manly man to be an abbot able, you see that. And also with that, you get to see there is a portrayal of friar. Through this, he has actually portrayed and given us an entire realistic picture of the age in the first place. All right, you also get to see that this kind of a journey is actually taking place in the month of spring. Okay, so you get to understand that winter, the spring is something which is indicated by T.S. Eliot when we read Wasteland, when he sees that April is the cruelest month. But you get to understand that winter has died and now it's the beginning of spring. The coming of spring marks a lot of happenings. Like in one place, you get to see that spring is the kind of rejuvenation. All right, till now, the situation used to be if of a kind where the people will have to store smoked beef and then, stay inside the home, stay inside badly lit fireplaces, and be in this kind of a juncture or with this kind of a hold when and with the coming of spring, there is a sudden rejuvenation of life. This rejuvenation of life is celebrated because of a voyage, or let's say a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket. All right, and that is to just celebrate the rejuvenation which has been brought about by the coming of spring in the first place. This is what we actually celebrate the month of April, when this voyage to the shrine of Thomas Becket has begun. That is something which is extremely contradicted when we see T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where he talks about April being the cruelest month in the first place. All right, one cannot deny that when we look at Chaucer, we also talk about the fact that he invented the rhyme royal in his writings as well. You also understand that apart from that, he has a rhyme scheme in his writings, and along with that, he has given us a more realistic portrayal of the characters which governed the 14th century England. One has to understand 14th century England only against the backdrop of these writings, against which have created a picturesque writing of the 14th century England. Next, we talk about Renaissance. When we talk about Renaissance, we talk about the revival of the kind of writings, the revival of art in literature. Also, we also look at how Bible was translated. One of the most important grounds, Bible was translated, and what is the purpose of this translation? The purpose of this translation is so that Bible is actually available for even the middle classes. Earlier, the Bible was not written in English, so it made it very difficult for people who belong to the middle classes in order to understand the scripture in the first place. Now, with the coming, now the institution of church has been made accessible for everybody. It is not just reserved for the clergy or for the upper class people. All right, so we get to see Sir Philip Sidney inaugurated the vogue of the sonnet, and he was the one who in his criticism had written a defense of poetry, appreciating poetry and talking about the importance of poetry in the first place. All right, so the motive of most of these writings were on the idealization of the beloved, right? Love songs and ballads and lyrics came about in the Renaissance period. And under this, towards the end of the Renaissance writings, we get to see two kinds of very important writings, that is metaphysical poets, and the other one is your Cavalier poets. When we talk about metaphysical poets, it's impossible that we do not talk about Donne's writing. All right, so Donne was, had written some of his poetries, which is a metaphysical poetry in the first place, and that we will look at what are the categories of metaphysical poets before we venture into understanding what was the kind of writing which Donne took in his writings. We look at how, when we look at metaphysical poets, we get to see a kind of wit in his writings. You get to see how a very common portrayal, what we see in metaphysical writings, is the kind of the pompous portrayal of lovers, how they are together, and yet you get to understand that the lover is all moving all across the world. At the same time, he's connected to his beloved at the same time. This kind of a different portrayal, a kind of witticism, which is incorporated in the writing, made metaphysical poetry prominent in the first place. Also with that, you get to see a kind of we are looking at world from a more rational point of view. You get to see how the compass is a more technical, description in his writing. Even for that matter, when Donne wrote this poem by flea, okay, when the flea has, extracted the blood, from that of the poet, he says that, now I am in the flea and the flea is in me. Our love has, mingled. That's a kind of writing that you get to see where there's some sort of a witticism which has been, involved in the writings. And also you get to understand that through these writings, the focus is on to cater to the rational mind of the readers rather than catering to the the emotive mind of the readers. All right, so you get to see that in some place, there is a line which the poet talks about when he uses in his word the flea, that as though both the flea and the lover have, or let's say the poet have, somehow will engage in a premarital sex. That's a writing it was so boisterous also, for that matter, for Donne to write flea, sometime in the 17th century in his writings as well. All right, so also the fact that bitten by the flea also indicates that it would it would represent a kind of sin or a shame, or as though a loss of maidenhead, is a point which is also communicated through the writings. Also, you get to see, through in the writing, it also goes about to say that she's apt to kill him. He says, but he asks that she not kill herself by killing the flea that contains her blood. He says that to kill the flea would be sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. All right. So through this writing, you get to see through the words what Donne uses in his writings is only to churn the rational mind of the audience rather than catering to the emotive mind of the audience in the first place. All right, and his idea is to safeguard, let's say, a highly sophisticated defense of love against this corrupting values of politics and privilege in the first place. All right, so this is also, most of these metaphysical poets and his writings also portray Donne's journey from secular kind of writing to a more religious kind of writing, a journey from secular poems to religious poems as well. And also we get to see in his writings that, like especially when we read the poem by name Canonization, you get to see the poem is, it is to someone who disapproves the speaker's love affair. All right. And, he, also he parodies in his writings Petrarchan notions of writings. And he also portrays some kind of an intensity and uniqueness of love in the writings as in the first place. Also, you get to understand that there are varied rational descriptions. Like one of the description, what he talks about is like the moths drawn to a candle, like, her one, me another fly, then what they are, then that they are like the candle itself. So you get to see that, there are elements of the eagle, strong and masculine, and dove, peaceful and feminine. So you get to see a, in varied-based contrast that has been brought together, to portray a paradoxical style, which has been incorporated, in his writings. Like, for example, when when the poet hymn to God the Father, even there you get to see that Donne would have ended the poetry by saying that though I am done, but I'm not yet done. All right. So there is a play of words, there is a pun in his writings. So there is a kind of stirring of the intellect, which is involved in the writings when compared to that of the other writings which govern the age. Till now, the kind of writings was, only to celebrate love, or let's say to talk about the idealized form of love. Even here, when we look at metaphysical writings, there is an idealized picture of love. But more than that, there is also a portrayal of, the symbol of all these writings is actually governed by the idea of love, a more rational sense of how love is perceived in writings. When we look at Cavalier poets, quite contrast to that is the kind of writing which is more light in style. All right. So Cavalier poets generally avoid the subject of religion, and they do not, delve much into the subject of religion in the first place. There is nothing into delving into the depths of soul. Unlike how, you observe it in metaphysical poetry, there is, a need in order to churn or ponder into the soul of the man in the first place. But here there is, there is no delving into the soul or the religion in its writing in the first place. Also, there is a more joyous kind of a writing where you get to understand that in Cavalier poets, life is far too enjoyable for, it must be, rather than to be sweating in verses of study. So this is a more lighter kind of writings like George Herbert, who took to Cavalier poetry writing, which is more light-hearted when compared to the kind of writings which was brought about by the metaphysical poetry. There was a kind of a direct colloquial language, and then there was a high catering to a more high individualistic personality, in its writings. And also there was a adherence to the more casual, amateur, and affectionate poem. This was perhaps the first time we are slowly breaking away from the more idealistic and idealized fashion of poetry which existed in the ages till this particular date. With that, because poetry actually came about, the kind of poetry what we look into came about especially after the era of Reformation and in the era of Restoration. Though when we talk about Restoration, we generally talk about prose. We talk about Dryden and Pope and the kind of prose that they had written. But we also came to understand that Restoration was an age of rational thinking. It was an age of intellectual thinking. And you get to see how, we are doing away with all kind of, imaginative style and ornate description which govern this poetry. Under this category, I would want to comment about two poems in the first place. One is Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel, and the other one is Pope's The Rape of the Lock. All right. So on one hand, you get to understand how Dryden in Absalom and Achitophel, it is written a kind of a political satire. It is also catered to a biblical imagery, and alongside that, he is also portrayed a political satire in its writings. And these are not, ornate in its writings, but then, rather they are catering to a more intellectual subject, something which is more realistic, which is not imaginative style in its writings. On the other hand, when you look at Pope, who has written his poem by name, The Rape of the Lock, who critiques a kind of society, the 18th century society, which critiques, or perhaps it's a kind of a mock heroic poem, as we call, The Rape of the Lock, which is a kind of a battle which comes about all because of the lock of a woman. The lock, and also, the battle, the weapons which are being used in the battle are like hairpins and, the toiletries. The very fact of, Belinda, who is one of the characters in the mock heroic poem, the whole procedure of her getting ready is, considered to be one of the most significant aspects of the poem in the first place. Also, for that matter, you get to see the kind of, parody that has been done to the kind of to the style of writing which existed beyond the, prior to the, Restoration age, which, in lieu of catering to a more archaic language and sublime style and a sublime subject, in the external sphere, at least at a peripheral sphere, we get to understand that the topic that they are dealing with is actually to showcase the high class fashionable women of the society, where the topic of the duel is just the lock of Belinda. Also, we get to understand that the focus on lapdog and focus on the frivolous matters which govern the age, which was critiqued in the writings of Pope in the first place. All right, we get to understand that most of these Restoration period writings governed a lot and showcased a lot on showcased much on the society of that particular time. Here, I would also want to bring about that beginning from the Restoration age, we are actually bringing about a kind of writing which caters to the imitation of art through the society, through the lens of society. Like looking at the lens of the society, one is actually imitating the poetry or the art in the first place. All right, so most of these writings where, as you can observe, was governed by reason, moderation, good taste, and simplicity. All right, so when we are looking at it, one might question as to why Pope's writings are a kind of a deviation from, the kind of Restoration age. This kind of a Pope's writing was actually to critique the sense of writing which existed beyond the Restoration, prior to the Restoration age in the first place. It was to cater to a good taste of poetry. Though one might even also understand that when we look at Restoration age, we only look at prose writings which originated in the Restoration age, but two of the most important writings which came about was a satire. One was a social satire, the other one was a political satire. Like Absalom and Achitophel goes about as a political satire, Pope's Rape of the Lock was to comment on the social satire in the society at that particular time. Like we get to understand that, when we look at Dryden, he was the one who was, brought about the poetic genre of the age, and he polished the heroic couplets. You get to understand that what is a heroic couplet? That is when you have a pair of or a sequence of rhyming pairs of iambic pentameter lines. So the rhyme is always masculine. All right, so maybe ends on the stressed syllables. All right, so that's why it's known as masculine. You understand that when we look at an iambic pentameter, you have one unstressed syllable and one stressed syllable. So that's why you get to see that the rhyme always ends on the stressed syllable. So that's why this makes it as the rhyme is always masculine in the first place. All right, so he brought about moderation and a good taste in its writings. It is worth a marvel to look at how Absalom and Achitophel, which extends about 1,500 rhymes, all in iambic pentameter, all in heroic couplet. That's a marvel to look at, and all the more, though placed under a backdrop of against a backdrop of let's say a political happening. Again, though it be that the case, one who reads the poem, would be able to cater to the society of the Restoration period. So from here, the kind of writings which we're going to observe, be it the Romantic age or let's say be it the Victorian age, we are looking at writings which are actually mimicking the society and the politics, this political, social, and cultural sphere of the age, influence the writings eventually. Right. We talk about age of Pope. So, you get to understand that he's deeply conservative. On one hand, the very fact that, Pope's writings are actually demeaning women and their ways and perhaps stereotyping women, that's talking about, that portrays very clearly the conservatism in his writings. And alongside that, you also get to see that, there is a strong reference to classical myths and forms. The very fact that Pope has resorted to an archaic style of writing, it understands that, how he reveres, a classical mode and form of writing. Alongside that, you also get to see, you get to reflect the ease and the harmony and the grace, the lines flow about from one to another. Though the style looks quite, formal, but then yet, the topic which is adhered is extremely light. All right. So this is also to talk about the fact that, generally when we talk about a heroic poem, poem, we always talk about that the expression would be too lucid. But this is just to perhaps even comment or portray a satire on those grounds that, the kind of content which goes in this writing is actually light. You get to see how in Rape of the Lock, the content which has gone about in framing these poetry is extremely light, and it's, the qualities precise. There is no, though the style has taken to be too lucid, but the content inside the poem has taken out to be too light in its writing. And it was both Pope and Dryden have actually become, have portrayed or perhaps written satirical poems critiquing the political as well as the social happenings of the age in the first place. All right. We talk about, the age of Johnson, where, there is a sense of respect for a good, judge, but for the ordinary people and the standards of taste, which would, cater to people who do not even belong to a set of a social class. I guess this is even the beginning of the romantic style of poetry. The romantic style of poetry, which, began with the preface to lyrical ballads, catered to the fact of of writing poetry, which is, an overflow of spontaneous emotions and feelings, rather than it being a forced kind of a writing. All right, so here you get to see that slowly poetry is waning from that of the educated and scholarly masses to the fact of, looking at poetry and seeking inspiration in the most everyday aspects of life, and looking at perhaps the most lucidity in the more everyday aspects of life in the first place. All right, so they, here from onwards, you understand that from the age of Johnson in the first place, you get to see a more universal and permanent, elements in, human experience. And from where is it that the inspiration is building up? The inspiration is actually building up from nature in the first place, where, nature becomes a source of inspiration which governs human life. And one feels that, we do away with the artificial intellectualism which governed the 18th century, and we move to a more emotive style of writing, which is catering to an everyday language, catering to people who are the everyday people, who are not just the scholarly audience, and to a theme which is more of an everyday, focusing on the mundane life of people, rather than focusing on a theme which is so quite extraordinary or beyond the age, a kind of poetry which is accessible to, any audience, be it the scholarly or the not so scholarly ones. You get to understand that how, like, for example, as we move ahead to talk about, romantic age, we get to see how there is a move from the more rational kind of a writing to a more emotional kind of, writing in the first place, where, there is a preference, there's a move from the social norms which govern the age. There is a focus on the individual man, the passion of that particular individual, and the will of that particular person which govern that particular age. Also, we get to understand that we are not giving a more generalized or a typical experience. We're giving a kind of an experience which is quite catering, quite individualistic in its style of portrayal. Like, for example, like when John Keats, one of the romantic age poets, who writes in his Ode to a Grecian Urn, he talks about the permanence of life. Like, the urn, which has a historical depiction. The urn has an art. So the writer, or let's say the poet, questions, what is permanent? Is art permanent, or is life permanent? Because an individual dies and the ashes are actually there in the urn. What is permanent? Art is all the more permanent. So we get to understand the permanence of art, which is, which is stressed by, romantic writings in the first place. And with that, we also understand that, we catered on the more simple and the more natural things in its writing. For example, when Wordsworth wrote the poem Lucy, you get to see how, it talks about that small flower which grows behind a stone, all right, the germination of a flower behind that of a stone. That is something that you see, a very simple style of writing, the simple lives of people, the lives of rustic people, their emotions, their overpowering of emotions governed by nature in the first place. Also, the kind of writings which says, which portrays the sync between nature, the mood of nature and the moods of an individual was also brought to a sync in the first place. All right. We also get to understand that, some of these writings also cater to strange, exotic, and mysterious. That is Coleridge's writings. One would always recall Kubla Khan, where Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan. 4,000 of his lines of the poem was actually written when he was in a dream state, and he was disturbed in its dream state, and then he got up to pen down the 4,000 lines of this poem. So even Coleridge, when he writes his criticism, that is Biographia Literaria, he even writes it there that he talks about the willing suspension of disbelief. So that's the reason, why, the poetry caters on the strange, the exotic, and the mysterious. Also, for that matter, like I said, how nature and the moods of the nature has been incorporated in the writing, or let's say has been, in sync with the mood of an individual. You get to see how the, even in Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, you get to see the melancholy of the nightingale, which is shared by the melancholy of Keats as well. All right. So this was, an understanding what we look about when we talk of romantic age in the first place, which catered to a more everyday, ordinary portrayal. There is a move from focusing on the more grand aspects of life to more everyday aspects of life, appreciating and drawing essence of life from nature being the guiding force, which would, govern writings, or, serve as an inspiration for art to mimic the life in the first place. On one hand, people would have even critiqued romantic writings, or let's say even romantic poetry, as being quite, what do you say? It's being quite distanced, or let's say, as imaginative on those grounds. Okay, there is a deliberate, measure to move away from societal aspects as an escape from reality, right? Like, yes, that was the line. Look at romantic writings as an escape from reality. And that is something what one gets to see, when you look at romantic writings in the first place. So, we get to see a similar kind of writing when we get to see, read Wordsworth's Daffodils, or, we get to see, read, even for that matter, the Rhyme of the Ancient, Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Also, for that matter, a very famous poem one gets to read about is Ode to a West Wind. Everybody might have heard of the famous lines which, end P.B. Shelley's poem, if winter is here, can spring be far behind. How one can connote, nature, and, sync that with, the everyday moods of the person in the first place. Like, you get to understand that if winter is here, if bad times are here, can good times be far behind? So that, looking for, inspiration from nature and infusing it in everyday life, or rather garnering some kind of an inspiration to lead everyday lives was, brought in through these writings as well. Also, we have one other writer whom we look at when we talk about romantic style of writing is Byron. We cannot deny that Byron is the most passionate of, all the kind of, writers who has come about, portrays that fiery passion in his writings. And also, for that matter, that, most of these writings also delve on the sense of nostalgia. Like, you get to see Tintin Abbey or Prelude, which talks about how Wordsworth was, reminiscing his, his childhood days against the stream of, Tintin Abbey, how he's, reminiscing his childhood, and penning down the nostalgia which comes from it. So, the nature serves as the source of, emotion, which sparks the emotions, let's say, in Wordsworth, and that comes out with, the writing of the age, or let's say, which sparks the writing of the age in the first place. All right, so that comes about as a romantic style of writing. Romantic style of writing was, especially romantic poetry, was a kind of a deviation, which deviation from the more structured kind of poetry which was brought about in the in the age of reason, as we call it, or the age of a restoration age, or the age of Augustan age, as we call about in the first place. This imaginative style of writing, which also catered to solitude, it was as though there is a kind of an imagination which one is catering to. There is a kind of a solitude. We're only talking of the individual man while we write romantic poetry. And then slowly with that, we delve into the next kind of writings, that is your Victorian writings. Before we go ahead with that, we also talk about the second generation of romantic poets that was, who were extremely revolutionary. We talk about, Shelley's writings, who brought about an external tyranny of rulers, customs, or superstitions is the main enemy. So there is a kind of doing away with all the kind of restrictions which govern poetry and its writings. Very true, like I told you, Byron in its fiery spirit has also brought about a sense of social realism and has brought about satire while he portrays the social realism in his writings. Also, Shelley, focuses on inherent human goodwill sooner or later. Like I said, a very common line which talks about P.B. Shelley's, Ode to a West Wind, where when he says of this line, there's a kind of a rejuvenation of a positive, there's a hope, building up of a hope of coming up of coming in of a more positive life in the first place, that you get to a positivity, a sense of hope rather, which is brought in by nature, inspiration drawn in from nature. All right. And then, we talk about, an eternal reign of transcendent love. All right. So that is, all governed by the sense of hope. And from where do you garner this hope? Who is the, giver, or let's say the nurturer of this hope? That's nature in the first place. All right. The next one, what we talk about is Keats' poetry, who caters to a kind of, sensuous, impressions in his writings. You get to see that, there is an immediate awareness of sensation, especially about how when he's writing a poetry, and the song of a nightingale actually makes him sing to the fact of the melancholic mood which is brought into the writing, and that sensation has been brought down in the lines of the poetry as well. This poetry was absolutely considered to be a pure poetry, which is not governed by any will or any purpose in writing. All right, till the time, most of these writings, especially we talk about Restoration Age, they were so governed by political and social aspects. It was as though romantic poetry was a kind of a cleanser, which, which brought about poetry, art for art's sake. That's something what you see, in these writings, where the poetry did not cater to in any way, the artificialities, or let's say the, any external governing aspect to write a poetry. All that which was brought about is a kind of emotion the poet goes about while he's, penning down the poetry in the first place. And with that, we come to Victorian style of writings. When we talk about Victorian writings, this is actually a kind of the beginning of, modern age in its writings. Like you get to see about a shift from, shift from solitude to society, shift from, let's say, to imagism, or imagination to, pragmatism. There's a shift from, concepts to issues. Suddenly in Victorian era, with the coming of industrialization, we're talking about society, we're talking about social issues. And also to talk about Victorian era, we talk about two aspects in that era. On one hand, we talk about the positives of the era, that is, brought in by colonization, colonialism especially, and the other, the negatives, is also talking about, how most of these writings talk about with the coming of industrial revolution, how there has been a waning of a religion in the first place. Also with that, you get to see, I have brought in two writers. One is Tennyson and Browning, and the other one is pre-Raphaelite poetry, which governed the Victorian era. We talk about in Tennyson's poetry, especially who wrote Ulysses. When we look at Victorian poetry, there is a strong, adherence towards, let's say, you talk of towards the medieval fables, especially the fable of Homer's Odysseus. All right, so which is brought about, which is the inspiration to write Tennyson's Ulysses. You get to see about Victorian colonialism when we talk about Tennyson's poetry. You talk about how the quest for Ulysses to his unquenching thirst to move beyond the age and traverse beyond the margins of the age, that unsatiating urge for travel. So that unsatiating urge has also been translated as something sinning, something sinister in its quality, because the very fact that Ulysses was so involved in his insatiating thirst for travel that he's actually forgotten the responsibilities of the Victorian manhood. Though he left it to Telemachus, but then yet the fact that he has left his Victorian manhood, Victorian, masculinity, the roles of Victorian masculinity in order to cater to frivolous adventure and pursuit of knowledge and unsatiating quest for knowledge is something which is brought in by Tennyson's poetry. Most of Tennyson's writing, who was actually a poet laureate even at those times, talks about the more positive aspects of the period. It also talks about how, there was a kind of, talking about, political power in the first place. Whenever we imagine England at that particular time, we always imagine England as a giant hawk. We always imagine England as, trying to conquer. If you remember, Victorian era takes in, British had, or let's say the English had conquered 5% of the entire globe was, or the world was under the reign of the English. So you get to see that sense of colonialism, that positive trait has been brought into the writing of Ulysses, that no age or no health or no responsibilities or nothing can stop him or rust him to cater to the mundane life of the age, and and stop him from not pursuing the sense of adventure and travel and knowledge that is brought in by Ulysses' spirit for travel. You also get, on the contrary, you get a more, deep idea of Browning's writing. Poem, My Last Duchess, and then say, it is talking about Victorian control and power on the first hand. How the poetry, when you look at My Last Duchess, you get to see about how, Browning has actually held the reins of, his wife. All right, you get to see about how the poem talks about the fact that she extended a smile to everybody who came across, from a fool in the orchard about cherries, or let's say to riding a wine. The Duke felt that she's not under his possession. She's not being like that, like that horse who has to be under the control of the Duke, and that's the reason why she was murdered. So that is something which actually shows us, necessitates the kind of roles which a woman has to play in the society, in that particular age. And also with that, you get to see symbols of Victorian power and domination. Like the poem goes about to say that the Duke has no sense of guilt, where no sense of guilt or no sense of apprehension for the fact that he has murdered his wife. And in fact, he's telling his tale, saying that he has no flaws. Why? Because, there's a convoy, come up seeking the party is seeking a hand of the count's daughter, with that of the Duke. So, there are symbols of domination. Like when you see, Clause of Inbrook, you get to see the bronze statue in which Neptune is actually holding the reins, the control, of the sea horses, as the reins are there in his hands. So these are a symbol of Victorian control, power, and domination, and also the kind of roles which has been defined for women in the first place. All right. It is a mark of note, one has to observe, that most of the writings, especially in poetry, which required a more metrical style of writing, important that one caters to a scholastic education to be able to write this kind of a poetry. So women generally were restricted from writing this kind of poetry. And though this poem actually rested in portraying the social aspects and realism of the age, it is also important for us to understand the contrast of these writings, or let's say these poetries of the age, that is the pre-Raphaelite poetry. Pre-Raphaelite poetry catered to, a more biblical stance in its writing. You get to see about how, we have, like, for example, there's a poem by name Blessed Damsel, which talks about, the symbol of pure love, the symbol of pure death, the symbol of purity in love and death, rather Christian themes of, the tree, or let's say the symbol of dove, Mother Mary. All these Christian elements have been weaved in writing. Pre-Raphaelite poetry came about with the purpose that there was so much of realism which was infused in the kind of high Victorian poetry, that pre-Raphaelite poetry had to be more artistic in its nature. Somehow the writers, there was a conflict in the writers that, in portraying the social realism of the age, the very purpose of poetry is being compromised. So in order to cater to it, to perhaps, to retain the purity and sublimity of art, to retain, or perhaps to bring back the kind of ideals which existed with the Romantic age, is why we had, the pre-Raphaelite poetry, which catered to images, and which also gave a lot of attention to detail. Most of these poetries, like, there's a strong difference in the kind of writings what you see of Tennyson and Browning when compared to the kind of style of writing what you see with Rossetti, that is in Blessed Damsel, where there's a lot of imagery involved in description, which is not the case when you see Tennyson and Browning's writings. Tennyson and Browning's writings are more of a reflection of the age. Like, let's say, art mimics life. All right. So, that was a kind of, writing which brought about social realism, brought about in writings, unlike pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was a contrast. Let's say, life imitates art, or let's say art for art's sake. There's a split eventually, if between pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and aestheticism, which catered only for art's sake. And the next comes about is, Arnold's poetry. Arnold's poetry was extremely sorrowful, and pessimism. Why? Most of these writings, because we are talking about the waning of religion and the governance of science in this particular age, and we're also talking about the plight, how human plight has changed over times, how suddenly we understand that in this particular age there was let's say a reduction, or let's say there was a loss of the beacon light which governed Victorian age, and because there was a coming of science, there was a coming of industrial revolution. So this loss of a beacon light perhaps portrayed, man's disillusionment and, sorrowful and pessimism in its writing. Exactly like how Gothic fiction took birth in Victorian novels, which portrayed the coming of a dark age. Arnold's poetry portrayed something like that, of similar, the coming of dark age brought about through science and absence of religion in its writing in the first place. Arnold, for that matter, because we're talking about poetry and we're talking about in Victorian age, it's very important to understand Arnold's view of a study of poetry. Arnold, brought about three estimates in its poetry. He talked about the real estimate, the personal estimate, and the historic estimate. He talked about the fact that, when one is critiquing on the poetry of, let's say, any poetry for that matter, either they don't critique a poetry if it is placed under a historic backdrop. Let's say, like I said, how, Ulysses, when we read Ulysses, we read it against a backdrop of Odysseus, which is, a historic background for the tale, which adds value to the poetry. So time and again, perhaps we are so biased by the historical background of the poem, or sometimes we are biased by the personal attributes, what we like in a poetry, what are the themes, the kind of matter and manner, what we like in a poetry. So according to Arnold, one has to cater to the more real estimate of poetry, which is beyond these real, beyond these historic and personal estimate of poetry. He also talks about the fact that in Arnold's poetry about touchstones, he says that, there are certain kinds of poetry which has stood the test of time. All right, they are the kind of poetry which has the most absolute sense of poetic quality, not just in manner, but also in the matter of the poetry. Also, you get to see with that he tells us that tomorrow, if you're going to get any contemporary poem, and if you have to understand if this poem is of a good quality or not, what you do is or let's say of a high poetic quality or not, what you do is you select lines of that poem, the contemporary poem, and you compare it with these touchstones. What are these touchstones? Touchstones are poetry which have stood the test of time. They are the most absolute form of poetry, lucid in manner and in matter and in poetic quality and in diction and in theme. All this it's of a more supreme and sublime quality. And then you compare, the contemporary poetry with the lines of, Arnold's, these touchstones. And if you get the same poetic quality, then yes, you get to see that, the contemporary poetry is, is of, is of value, is of high, has high poetic quality. Otherwise, it does not have a high poetic quality in the first place. All right, so that governs about a lot of Victorian era's writings. Victorian era's poetry ranges in actually portraying the age, portraying the predicament of the consequences of industrial revolution, the positives of Victorian colonialism, how it brought about a focus on Victorian society and its people, the focus on the plight of Victorian man and women, the waning of Victorian, the beacon light which governed that particular age, and how that brought about the coming of dark age, and how somehow to bring about a balance in the excessive realism. And there was pre-Raphaelite poetry which came about that governed Victorian era's time. There was a sharp shift from romantic writings to Victorian writings. Romantic writings all focus on the adherence to man, a single individual. But in Victorian era, we are talking about the society. There is a portrayal of society. There is a portrayal of society in the first. You also get to see that that is, what you understand when we talk about Victorian era. And then we go about to talk about the 20th century to the present. When we talk about the 20th century, it is very important that we talk about, the kind of literature which was originated in the 20th century. We're talking about a kind of poetry which talks about moral degeneration in its writing. Slowly, the kind of poetry, even in Victorian age, the form of poetry is suddenly waning and moving from more metrical standards to a more blank verse style of writing. There is a more fragmented style of writing. The style of writing perhaps even portrayed the kind of atmosphere, or let's say the ambience of the age, or let's say the society during those times. Something very clearly elaborated through Eliot's Wasteland. Eliot's Wasteland is a symbol of modern poetry in the first place. You get to see about how the poem has been written in blank verse style of writing, how there is a gloom in the poetry that has been brought about, and also the kind of moral degeneration is also portrayed in this writing. That's why he says the 20th century as the wasteland. All right, and then the poem ends about to tell who shall set my lands in order. That. And the stress can be on any of these lines, like who shall set my lands in order, who shall set my lands in order, who shall set my lands in order. So this is about talking about a portrayal of moral degeneration of the 20th century literature in the first place. Also, for that matter, there has been a portrayal of mechanized style of writing, like when you talk about the typist girl, there is a second part of Wasteland. You get to see how the whole idea of sexual intercourse has also become a kind of too mundane, in its, portrayal. Alongside that, it also, the moral degeneration also brings about a focus on women. All right, there is this scene where, women are at the bar, and then, the bartender talks about, he tells, in the Wasteland that, talks about hurry up, please, it's time. So it means that, the bar is about to close, and, so it's hurry up, please, it is time for the bar to close. So it's time for you to leave. So it also talks about how women are, perhaps adding to the moral, degeneration in the society by staying in a bar late into the night. All right. And also it talks about, it talks about like how, Eliot ends these poems, like how, talks about, ends the poem by talking about, by using the lines, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So, like, he only prays for that fact, or perhaps wonders or hopes rather that, only, peace shall, prevail eventually, which might, perhaps be the solace in a dark age, that is the modern age, which comes about. This is, you talk about the sterile aspects of 20th century in its writings, and you also get to see, like, The entire wasteland begins with the writing, that is, begins with the line that is, April is the cruelest month. Why? Because there is a death of the Lord. When we talk of April, it talks about, the death of Christ. And then, eventually, yes, we also talk about resurrection. It talks about resurrection, but, it begins on a gloomy note. In talking about the death of the Lord, the death of the governing beacon light of that, particular age. Also, for that matter, it is very important to look at the kind of allusions which is being weaved into the age. It's extremely fragmentary. We have brought in allusions from, Eliot has brought in allusions from varied sources in its writing. There is reference to Philomel, there's a reference to Cleopatra, there's a reference to the nymphs, there's a reference to, the Hyacinths, there's a reference to London, there's a reference to, the London Bridge, there's a reference to, varied allusions have been brought together and weaved to make this kind of fragmented, poetry in the first place. You also get to see, the kind of, portrayal of nymphs and the sexual liaison, which was an attribute of, the 20th century poetry. As well. All right. On the contrast, you also get to see Yeats as more traditional, more profound and more, there is a kind of a poetic idiom which has been, added to Yeats's writings. Yeats also in its, had also catered or was quite influenced by biblical writings, which you see in his Sailing to Byzantium, which has been incorporated, which has certain biblical allusions, which has been, incorporated in the writings as well. Alongside 20th century, it is very important that, we also address writers by name Dylan Thomas and, Philip Larkin, who were, important writers in 20th century, who also catered to the disillusionment of man, the isolation of man, the alienation of man in the world. Here in 20th century literature, we also see two kinds of poetries. One is the war poets and other one is the Georgian poets. When we talk of war poets, it was actually to give a true picture of war in its writings. All right, so the realistic picture of war, or let's say the gruesome, bizarre imagery of war was brought in front of the audience. And suddenly we move away. Generally, when we talk of poetry, we always talked about poetry which should be, higher than that of life. But here it is poetry standing across the times, okay, at parallel with the times, at the time or in that particular age is something what you see in 20th century writings. There's definitely a sense of despair. There's a sense of there's a sense of gloom, what you see in these writings. The entire sect of Wasteland, through its 5 parts, actually showcases how the age has degenerated, and perhaps, how the age has absolutely gone down. And one aspect that has been spoken about is how the coming of industrial revolution has made lives to be so mechanized with time. So there is a lot of symbolic allusion. There's a lot of, historical allusions and legendary allusions which have been brought about and weaved into writings. There is a focus on, Ophelia. There's a focus on, Antony and Cleopatra. There's a focus on nymphs. There's a focus on Indian literature. There is a focus, varied allusions have been brought about, have been weaved in to structure, Eliot's Wasteland in the first place. So that is the kind of writing. And with that, actually, we, talk about the further, sense of, how poetry has actually further transgressed with time as well. You also talk about, Prue's private or esoteric symbolism, that is the kind of, poetry which is only intelligible to a few. For example, you have Ted Hughes, who writes this poem by name Thought Fox. He says that, the thoughts come to a mind of a poet exactly like slyly and just silently, or let's say, slyly rather, the walk of a fox is compared to how the thoughts has been, incorporated in, or the coming of thoughts in the mind of, Ted Hughes in the first place. All right. So, we talk about everyday poetry. There is no nonsense sentimental poetry in the first place. We also talk about how, today, when we talk of poetry, we also talk about haikus. We've gone or, broken free from the kind of poetry which only catered to long poetries. We have brought about, to short poetries as well, written in absolute, colloquial language. Sometimes, haikus are written in just short 2 or 3 lines to such an extent that, it is left, the meaning is so loaded and embedded in those, 3 lines of poetry as well. And as you know, it is so symbolic in its style of writing that it is only intelligible only to a few. It's more subtle, but yet loaded and lucid in the mind. This is characterized by experimentalism over time, because poetry slowly, crossed, the weight of time, the weight of the age, so it was subject to a lot of experimentation, which came about in its writings as well. We also get to see, most of these after the modern age, and especially in the postmodern age, we get to see how poetry has, taken to a more, to a catering of the self in its writing, how individual and itself has been incorporated as the major theme in the writings of postmodern poets as well. Before I actually put a closure to this topic, because I guess we are way beyond time, we also talk about some sense into American poetry. I'll just wrap up with a very short note on American poetry, because when we talk of American poetry, we also talk about, especially I would want to comment on confessional poetry per se. One of the most important writers, what we talk about confessional poetry is Sylvia Plath, one of the important American poets, who talks about rather a strong sense of radicalism is what you see in her writings. And more than that, you also see a very bold and violent imagery in her, a confessional poet in the first place. Over time, the kind of writing has taken to portray, not just, one might say, a critic might say, portraying violence in that particular age, but more that it has also brought about not to filter anything, not to mask anything, clothe anything with the cloak or language in its writing. Language has been, sometimes, like we say, in modern age and in postmodern age, words fail to deliver that sense of meaning. So that's why they have used the most direct words. There is a more direct style of writing which has been incorporated in these lines as well. Like I also said, we do not follow any meter. There are run-on lines. Okay, the meaning, the line might end at the designated spot, but the meaning actually can be garnered only if you move to the next line, what we call as run-on lines, or what we call as enjambment, where the meaning does not stop at the very point where the line, the line in the poem stops. The meaning runs on to the next line as well. So you get to see how, the form of the poetry, the meter of the poetry, the themes of the poetry, the language of poetry has become fluid and has, grown with time, has perhaps broken away from the kind of, barriers and, the kind of rules and metrics which weighed down, a clear representation of poetry in the first place. Also, for that matter, one needs to understand, as we talk about, confessional poets, over time, we get to see about, especially a more militant kind of a language, which has been incorporated in the language of, especially in the language of women who wrote about, who came about with writing, because, the kind of phallogocentrism which existed in the kind of writings by men, that took a turn, when women started writing, where, they had to look for right vocabulary and metrics. And that's the reason why, why language failed in, in structuring or, imparting, or in, let's say, in the foundation of poetry, especially in the postmodern ages. The kind of poetry what you observe in, in the contemporary age also caters to not just on societal lines, but, caters on a more symbolic, representation. We have broken away. There is no allusions have been a part, still continue to be a part of contemporary writings and contemporary poetry writings. And alongside that, we also understand versification of poetry. The blank versification of poetry has also, taken to the more, poetry has undergone a kind of fluidification with time, that it is able to take in all the changes that has been brought in after the modern and the postmodern ages. Also with that particular time, sometimes most of these poetries also retain that very same word in the vernacular language, which doesn't get translated over time, again because of the kind of logocentrism which can carry forward the same meaning with that particular essence. I would just want to put an end to my lecture by just commenting on the kind of poetry when we talk about Indian poetry in the first place, especially if we comment on the kind of poetry written by A.K. Ramanujam. You understand the kind of poetry what he wrote, or let's say K.K. and Daruwala, or let's say Nissim Ezekiel, or let's say for that matter Sarojini Naidu, or for that matter even the kind of poems which have been written by Tagore in Gitanjali. These range from looking at a more sublime aspect of life, a sublime aspect of God, to the more everyday aspects of life. Most of the Indian writing, or let's say Indian poetries, talk about the everyday aspects of life. Talk about like a river in A.K. Ramanujam's river. We talk about the river, especially let's say the kind of pond inside the temple premises. And you also the versification or the language and the content is so raw that clumps of hair has also been used as an imagery to bring about the realistic fervor in its kind of writings per se. Over time, we also understand that with the coming of Bhasha literature and with the coming of regional literature, each of these writings in vernacular languages, which has been eventually translated with time, that also portrays the regionalistic fervor in that writings. The kind of sometimes translators fail to retain that exact word because they might not get a right word in the in their language to in the English language to translate to. All right, so with this I would put an end to the tracing of poetry. One needs to understand how poetry, which was so vague and so metrical and so formal, and how it has grown to become quite informal with time. Poetry was the most idealized subject. It was the kind of writing which was encouraged in courts, though one can also talk about how Plato had discouraged poetry and had said that poetry is poets should be banished from the kingdom because poets resort to a lower degree of truth. But that's when Aristotle says that poetry does not just replicate history. Poetry in its writing also includes its the poet also includes his or her own thoughts, or and portrays the character in the poetry way larger than life. So we are portraying a poet, the writing, or let's say in copying history or copying life, we are portraying a symbol or a theme which is quite larger than life, which agrees. There can be no right note or to wrap up this lecture, but just on those grounds to look at how poetry has been that sort of fallback or refuge, as Aristotle says, because it portrays something which is more larger than life. The kind of characters or the themes which has been addressed is not just a basic mimicking of history, but it caters to characters and themes which is way beyond, which is which would perhaps bring about a cathartic sense. One can immediately resort to the feelings or emotions which is brought in by the characters which are who are addressed in the poetry per se, who are larger than life. They are not just everyday men and women whom you get to see. So poetry is perhaps the most the higher degree of truth, because it has portrayed a more universal kind of stature and a more universal kind of language has been used, which is definitely at times problematic because it does not bring into consideration the other regional literatures and, other bhasha literatures which exist around. But at the same time, it, caters to a more universal degree of truth, which remains unparalleled with any, other genre in English literature. Right. With that, I would put my closure. Thank you.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, ma'am, I'm not the host, but I would really like to steal a minute to point out that you remind me of Professor Keating from the Dead Poets Society. You were so visibly excited and happy to be talking about poetry. And I mean, yes, poetry does seem to have that effect on people, I know, but very few people actually allow it to, help themselves become so fascinating and beautiful and profound as a person because of it. I'm so glad to have attended this session, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm glad as well to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your instructions and guidance. And now to summarize the day, Dr. Prithvika discussed the British English literature period era poetries in detail and how the Anglo-Saxon period portrayed the chivalrous and heroic element and the importance of Chaucerian poetry, realistic portrayal in his writings, picturesque writing. She also discussed the Renaissance era, the two kinds of poetry, metaphysical, cavalier poets, and also about the Restoration period and the 18th century poets, the age of Dryden, Pope, and Johnson, how romantic age stressed emotions over reason, and also about the revolutionary second generation of romantic poets, how the Victorian era poets were more engaged in social issues, and the 20th century to the present poetry, which is a combined form of tradition and experiment writings, and ended with commenting on poetry in American literature as well as Indian literature. Ma'am, it was a great lecture and I feel really inspired by your words, and a great thanks. And now, before I conclude the event for today, I will like to announce the schedule for day 14th, which will be an interview about the success story of Mr. Dhanaya Kautigmat, and the host duty will be performed by Mr. Shivam Bhanushali here on this platform. So stay tuned because we are at the edge of successfully completing this e-workshop. So here on the behalf of the attendees and B.N.N.College, I would like to thank Dr. Prithvika for her precious time and for helping guide the aspirants present over here. It was great to have you with us, ma'am. And here I declare the end of the program. Thank you so much and good night to everyone.